T.S. Eliot projects a scene of trauma, upheaval, and disorientation in his poem, The Wasteland. And it is remarkable that amid the pile of cultural rubble and debris, through the cracks and reforms and bursts in the violet air, he unwittingly heralds the sound of modernity. Eliot's Revert poem seems to suggest that rupture and discontinuities make a necessary feature for change, modernity, and progress, and that culture and its representative identity does not survive untouched across spatial or temporal limits. What gives meaning to the term identity then? Is it an essential essence or something acquired, conceived in individuality or through a social influence? These questions form the subject of an increasingly pressing debate in the contemporary times that problematizes the traditional notion of culture as a unified symbol or a collective social identity. Since meaning afforded to one's cultural identity is positioned by and in discourse, one has to wonder that if one's language is distorted through discursive power of control, how can one articulate a unified self expression? And excellent examples for demonstrating this conflict are post colonial texts, which are a paradoxical side of struggle, subversion, modernity, and revitalization alike. It is a question worth asking, that, therefore, that why has their interpretation, for the most part, mostly in terms of national allegories? For instance, Frederick Jameson argues that all theological texts necessarily project a political dimension in the form of national allegory. Even a canonical figure such as Spivak focuses on allegorical analysis of post-colonial texts. Hence, in view of the recent and contemporary discourse on cultural identities, I believe a more nuanced and refined approach to the complexities of identity formation and representation is in order. And the goal of my study, Course of Cultural Paths, is twofold. Firstly, I hope to explore how we can reconceptualize literary representation of identity, the floating signifier of the contemporary times, from a transcultural perspective. Secondly, I aim to examine post-colonial texts as a sample case study of a modern diaspora that emphasizes the possibility of cultural identity as multi-accentuated, hybrid, aesthetically modern, and under constant transformation. And for a compelling analysis on the subject, I interpret Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children, Ben Okri's The Famished Road, and Alia Yunus's The Night Counter as a side of resistance to hegemonic forces, emphasizing the dialogic nature of language and identity. Also, instead of the postmodernist tendency of aligning allegorical analysis to migrant narratives, I interpret them through Martin's theory of heteroglossia in order to pose a hypothesis about a non national, modern subject, a composite of historical and present fragments. The analysis would determine these texts as the case of a case study of a modern diaspora and successfully refute a totalizing or reductionist approach to their interpretation. To begin with, growing dynamics of the contemporary era entail transnational experiences and mixing of languages, cultures, and identities because of increased mobility and interconnectedness. Therefore, it is important to establish that it is not only diasporic identities that go through transformation and rupture. While Althusser, with a Marxist perspective, understands the subject as culturally interpolated or positioned by class, Lacan sees identity as a murky reflection of the mirror stage of development, defined through a lack. And Butler, from a feminist viewpoint, defines identity through repression. That is, difference within is denied to form a difference in between. Post-colonial theorists, on the other hand, see the insidious power of discourse in determining or being determined by an established identity. These theoretical debates on the subject do determine, however, that it is difficult to construct an ideology of identity ignoring a social or positional influence. Hence, in an interesting approach to identity formation, Stuart Hall asserts identities as the positions that a person takes up, knowing that this representation is based on a lack from the place of the other and framed between axes of difference and rupture. His theory is supported by Bhabha, who encouraged a shift of the cultural debate to a dialogic to create a space of enunciation for a new concept of ethnicity. And Hall's approach seems to build on Bakhtin's hypothesis on novelistic discourse, which relies on language as a primary agent in constituting discourse. Additionally, Hall suggests imagining cultural identities in relation to at least three presences. For instance, presence European, presence African, and presence American. European would locate power and hegemony not only in terms of domination, but as a site of profound splitting and doubling in a post-colonial subject, while African is the site of irreversible displacement and of origin endlessly deferred. And American as the juncture point, the empty land, where cultural tributaries meet. Correspondingly, this model is easily facilitated in the artistic form of novels, which possess a stylistic three-dimensionality of multi-language consciousness. And Bakhtin contends that novels encompass layers of heteroglossia, literally meaning a variety of languages permeated with laughter, irony, humor, elements of self-parody, making it freer and more flexible. Therefore, it has a semantic fluidity, a living contract with unfinished, still revolving contemporary reality, which, if you think, is quite synonymous with a quest for identity. And Bakhtin's heteroglossia, exhibited in a novel either as polyphony or carnivalization, embraces multi accentuated identities. Also, this critical perspective makes Jameson's opinion that third world texts are as necessarily national allegories, particularly when their forms develop out of predominantly Western machineries of representation, quite problematic. And since most polemic post-colonial texts of the era make use of magical realism, it further facilitates heteroglossia in offering multiple possibilities of realities, truth, and identity. Rushdie's book, for instance, appears as a national epic relating the story of beginnings and peak times in Indian national history. Not only does it highlight the traces of what Hall described as the hegemonic influence of present European, Rushdie's phantasmagoric tale attempts to rewrite an absolute past with his parody of a Bildungsroman, where laughter destroys epic distance to expose the disparity between surface and center, between potential and reality. Just as Salim Sanai, the protagonist, had stated, things, even people, have a way of leaking into each other. Bakhtin's heteroglossia enters the novel in person and assumes material from within it in the images of speaking persons and multiple identities. Likewise, Oakre's The Famished Road appears to embody heteroglossic discourse wherein the protagonist himself becomes an ongoing site of struggle. There is also a certain fluidity of time and space in his Abiko realm, which offers scope of alternate realities and infinite possibilities. Hence, spatial distance seems inconsequential in his text, which sustains an actively polyglot world, and Azaro, the half-human, half-spirit Abiku child, persistently reiterates in the text that ours is an Abiku country. It keeps coming and going, a spirit child nation that keeps being reborn. Therefore, Okri's mythical tale diminishes national boundaries, and his text bears traces of presence African, with the prospect of an identity suspended between multiple realms and realities necessarily differ from a true origin. On the other hand, Alia Yunus's The Night Counter illustrates the quest of identity in a Hegelian notion, where Fatma, her protagonist, retraces her roots, going forward to meet that which she always was. There is also a pan-Asian aura to her tales, spread across the sands of time, where the nights are chronological, but the stories are not. They are intertwined, closely connected, and there's a palpable polyphony of characters as independent voices in a social framework. This text adds an additional dimension to the identity debate as it discusses the present American, a literal side of diaspora, as an example of inner expropriation of cultural identity, which leaves behind individuals without anchor, colorless, stateless, rootless, a race of angels. Therefore, the project Ghosts of Cultural Past, through a critical evaluation of migrant narratives, explores the experience of living identity through difference. In the words of Hall, is not the so-called return to roots, but a coming to terms with our roots. Also, interestingly, these condensed chimerical images of the magical realist texts are not unsimilar to Eliot's Wasteland that illustrated the painful task of unifying the entropic, saturated, and fragmented post-colonial experience. As Bakhtin noted, the world becomes polyglot, once and for all, and irreversibly. The period of national languages coexisting but closed and deaf to each other comes to an end. Hence, through this project, I hope to sketch a manifold post-colonial identity, reconceptualized with multiple presences, as a sample case study for a modern diasporic subject. It would suggest the emergence of a signifier that is aesthetically pure, free, independent, a shadow at evening rising to meet from a handful of dust. Secondly, it would nullify the totalizing perspective of migrant narratives and acknowledge a different approach to these texts as a side of modernity instead of simply national allegories. Moreover, it would determine post-colonial cultures as an example of local imaginaries, wherein one can recognize the asymmetrical balance of mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain, to constitute a new cultural and creative consciousness in an actively polyglot world.